The siege of Apokrovski seemed to be in its early stages of ending, but the Ukrainians resisted with rifle fire, taking down the Russian attackers, who kept coming wave after wave. They were small groups of 2 or 3 soldiers from Moscow who waited for the chaos caused by kamikaze drones and bombs to stun the enemies before entering Ukrainian trenches, causing chaos with grenades and rifles. Many of these small squads from Moscow were found by drones, living through the terror of being hunted. By this point, these aerial beaches were all over Apokrovski, terrorizing both sides. In the midst of this, during a siege against Russian troops, the Ukrainians had to face an unusual and disastrous decision made by their enemies. The Russians finally entered Apokrovski after more than a year of fighting toward the city, a split. It happened during weeks marked by successes, crimes, and a series of consecutive failures that not even Moscow's soldiers could explain. But the fact was that October marked the moment when the Ukrainians had to decide on exhausting and deadly urban combat or abandon a city that, at that point, was caught in a pincer movement, and with the undeniable presence of Russian forces spreading more and more among its ruins. He was the focal point of the Russian campaign to secure the Donetsk Oblast that year in 2025, representing the industrial heart of the region and an indispensable logistical hub for Ukrainian supply. Besides its military function, Apokrovsk was the main coal mining center and a key industrial hub in the Donetsk region, giving its control significant economic and moral value. The imminent loss of Apokrovski was far from marking the end of the war, but it was a very important point in the fighting in Donetsk, even much more than Bakhmut was. The Russian pressure in September and October culminated with allegations of deep infiltrations within the urban perimeter. In mid-October, the Russian modus operandi revealed a fundamental transition, the abandonment of Apokrovski. There were mass assault attacks in favor of tactical infiltration in small units. This tactic was made possible by air and electronic saturation. In addition, they took advantage of weather conditions so that these small groups would not be spotted. This factor persisted south of Apokrovski, where the main infiltrations occurred at that time. The explosions in the city shook the Ukrainian defenses, who were waiting for their leaders' main decisions on what they should do. It was undecided about whether to abandon or resist Pasav. The Russians kept advancing persistently, unleashing fire from the skies to clear the path as they moved forward. The Russian advance helped open up the area so that drone operators could cover almost all of Apokrovski with their attacks. They hunted them down. They saw the Ukrainians in hiding places, inside houses, flying between the rooms of the residences, until they found the soldiers and blew them up. Not every Russian soldier made this journey on foot. Sometimes they used unconventional vehicles for war. They were faster, but they used more predictable routes, which allowed them to be ambushed by drones. A group of these soldiers tried to defend themselves from the threat by shooting at the drone flying toward them. They quickly realized their shots had failed. They were still lucky to run and only watch the impact without being injured by the shrapnel. The Ukrainians sent their kamikazes to eliminate these men on foot after their motorcycles and cars were destroyed. The flights, circling in a hurry, were skillful, letting the Russians' desperate shots wander through the air until the moment of the final dive. Many of these Russians were fatally hit near the roads, where their equipment was destroyed, their corpses piled up among the trees. Sometimes, they fired while crouching on the ground until the impact turned their bodies into smoldering, blackened flesh on soil already used to explosions. But That didn't matter to the Russian commanders, who targeted the Ukrainian defenses around Pokrovsk, breaking them with drone attacks. The spies in the sky spotted the Ukrainian soldiers entering well-built trenches, but with enough space for one of the demons to lurk and surprise the soldiers in a moment of rest. Grenades rained down on Ukrainians watching the trenches. These eliminations gave an opportunity to the pairs or trios of Moscow fighters who had survived the long walk through the fields. They entered the trenches, taking advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians were hiding. The grenades continued this series of detonations against the enemies, before the soldier ventured out with his finger on the trigger and the rifle heating up. With the shots heading into the darkness of the shelter, a man already inside the trench, it was a huge risk, especially if the defending soldiers weren't aware. The drones kept searching for the enemies, trying to flush them out like hunting dogs did with foxes. The explosion sent many of the soldiers fleeing, fearing more drones and Russian artillery. The mistake was running in the open field, while the pair of Moscow soldiers were inside the trench. At Kalashnikova 74M, shots echoed across the field, some of them tearing through the flesh of a Ukrainian, bringing the man down for good. Other defenders managed to duck and avoid the deadly lead in their skin. Afterwards, they ran to take cover among the trees, hoping to escape more drones. Russian artillery began to target the area, striking the ground nearby and sending shrapnel flying, breaking branches. In the middle of the bushes, the Ukrainians lived in terror until they had a chance to evacuate. The soldiers in the captured trenches didn't have much time to celebrate. The Ukrainian drones arrived soon to check what was happening, some carrying grenades to take out the enemies. An explosive came down on the Russian, touching his head before detonating as he tried to escape with a force that shattered his skull and threw his helmet dozens of meters away. The corpse fell with the burned and destroyed brain matter spreading across the ground. But the efforts around Pokrovski didn't prevent these men from entering the city and starting to hide among the buildings. It was time for another hunt and a series of crimes. The Russians saw the Ukrainians preparing a shelter under the ruins of one of the houses destroyed in the shelling of the buildings. It could have been a good hiding place if the drones hadn't spotted the strategy. The artillery shelled the place, blocking the passage and preventing anyone still alive from getting out. Having destroyed more and more defenders, the Russians persisted in their pairs or trios, entering the edges of the city. More and more of them were seen being chased by drones wherever they were spotted. They fired trying to save themselves or desperately cowered in the rain of death coming from their own side. The explosion ended the missions of many of them. Pokrovsk. But the Russians also had drones that flew inside the city, searching for Ukrainians moving through the streets of Pokrovsk. The first drone exploded in front of the pickup truck, so close that the soldiers in the back could feel the heat from the blast. They looked up at the sky, cursing, expecting more of the swarm to be nearby. Another one came after them. It was spotted approaching in a low flight, but now, aftermath Kalashnikova shots took out the threat. The shrapnel still flew over the Ukrainian's body, drawing more curses. These Russian attacks happened several times inside Pokrovsk, undermining the defenders' quick positioning. Sometimes, a lone Russian managed to enter the city still with a whole quad bike. The drones finally noticed him, swooping down like blades from the sky and tearing the vehicle apart in a violent flash. The Russian miraculously survived and kept searching for shelter. But by then, surveillance over him was already high. The next drone did not spare him the pain of having his flesh disintegrated by the explosion. Even with that effort, more of them showed up. A group finally managed to reach the train station. They fired at the first people they saw. They were all civilians. Residents of Pokrovsk shot by Russian rifles. Many died in the streets after months trying to survive in the middle of that war. There were still several people living in the city because they couldn't evacuate in time or by their own choice. Their bodies were left scattered among bloodstains. A woman was left lying on the ground, wounded, until one of the crime survivors carried her away. She couldn't be evacuated so easily, as the soldiers warned about the risk of leaving the city, due to the large number of drones attacking all vehicles. The Ukrainians found the killers still hiding near the station. Justice fell upon them in the form of drones, first blowing up the roof to clear the way for the pursuit on the ground. They were hunted down quickly. Nothing that happened to these Russians would bring back the lives of the civilians. But at least it seemed like it would give the Ukrainians some time to evacuate more people from the city or decide what to do with Pokrovsk. More Russians would keep coming. Many of them would pass by dozens of corpses in the middle of the roads or the trails leading to Pokrovsk, but that didn't matter. The Russian strategy was to send as many of these small groups as possible, mainly taking advantage of the fog at that time, which made it difficult for drones to see and the shortage of infantry inside the city. Now, everything indicated that it was only a matter of time before it fell. The Ukrainians would have to decide between intense and potentially disastrous urban combat, like in Bakhmut or Avdiivka, or withdrawing from an important defensive axis. Even with the imminent capture of Pokrovsk by the Russians, the Ukrainians had something to celebrate: the mistake and disregard of the enemy commanders for the lives of their subordinates allowed a victory further north. The Ukrainians knew that the Russians had infiltrated the villages north of Pokrovsk. They advanced almost 20 kilometers in a few days, but it was a disorganized advance, without proper protection of the rear. They were small groups of soldiers, now hiding among the houses. The Ukrainian units began to flush these men out. The rifles were closing the circle around the fighter with no support. Only the messages from their radios echoed, warning their commanders to send more of their men. Some ended up surrendering, while others received grenades as a gift inside the houses where they hid. The drones marked the location of these Russians in the cities so that any kind of available bomb could be dropped on them. Despite this, the Russian kamikazes were lying in ambush, waiting for the Ukrainian squads to try to take out these soldiers before they could reach the Russians. The Ukrainians were caught, chased through the villages in what was beginning to look like a desperate attempt by some groups from Moscow to prevent the Kremlin soldiers from being completely surrounded. But it didn't work. Some of those soldiers from the first advance were surrounded, as happened in Vasily, where they were quickly killed. In 3 days, one of the villages had already been retaken. But the rest was not easy at all. The fighting continued for over a month. The Ukrainian squads had their rifles ready for the assaults, greeting the Russian incursions with heavy ammunition. 2 shots passed through the dry branches, tearing the Russian skin open for death to enter. The Ukrainian advanced to check the corpse on the ground. There were still more enemies moving through the area. The Ukrainians got ready in the middle of the forest. The rifles waited patiently. The ammunition in the chamber was ready to fly. The soldiers moved to search for the enemy, passing by fresh corpses. When they finally spotted the opponent, they opened fire. It was time to act quickly, testing the rifle's ability to fire hot rounds in all directions. More Russians were taken down, while others simply retreated from the area. But many of them were still trying to move forward, not understanding how the Ukrainians had reorganized their defenses. They didn't realize there were soldiers, like the men from the Skala battalion, with their rifles aimed to produce more fresh corpses for the tragedy count. The shots had already brought them down in that war. 3 of the men bled on the ground. While one of the wounded tried to save himself, the men showed up to finish the job. As always, that war had no intention of sparing anyone. Death was wherever there was a lens in the sky. It was that gaze among the clouds that spotted, from dozens of kilometers away, the Russian machines moving in a strategy that hadn't been used for months in that region. Suddenly, the first column of armored vehicles began to move to try to break the Ukrainian siege in the Counterattacks and Volodymyrivka region. Between 5:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, Moscow launched an attack with 22 armored vehicles. The largest column, with 11 units, left the area in the settlement of Linivka around 7:50 in the morning. The drones of the 1st Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard in the Zov performed well with continuous explosions on the battlefield. The small columns of smoke were seen from a distance, repeatedly striking the reinforced Russian machines, but managing to stop several of them. Tanks and infantry fighting vehicles started to emit smoke, losing their resistance in the face of so many consecutive explosions. Azov started filming the carcasses of some of them, knowing that others were coming further behind. A trio was detected, which already sent the message for a new swarm of drones to take off. The detonations put on their spectacle of destruction, leaving more burning metal carcasses behind. As proof of efficiency, some soldiers managed to escape from the steel sarcophagi. The drones found them walking through the woods. The hunt was easy, making their exposed corpses further proof of the irresponsibility of some Russian commanders. The armored vehicles were finished off later, ensuring the loss of at least 9. The Russians didn't learn from their mistake. To the surprise of the Ukrainians, and especially the Russian soldiers, the commanders launched another assault. Just like before, in that direction, in just a few days, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade watched as Moscow's columns approached their turtle tanks, covered with improvised steel on top of what should have been high-level protection designed by military engineering, began to take hits from Ukrainian drones, turning into metal bonfires along the road. Sometimes, the column of smoke signaled failure. Even so, other Russians kept moving forward, some on motorcycles, trying to be fast, but only hastening their fate to the Valley of the Dead. Frightened soldiers were chased by the kamikazes. Bombs were dropped from the skies to finish off the armored vehicles stopped on the roads, while the 82nd Brigade was finishing its work. The 1st Corps of the Ukrainian National Guard, Azov, had to leave their rest to deploy the drones. More motorcycles heading towards Volodymyrivka. The explosions knocked down the Russian riders. Bones broke during the falls and detonations, but they kept coming, piling up more and more bodies and motorcycle wreckage on the roads. The smoke hid the terror among the Russian soldiers. The armored vehicles took longer to arrive in what was already the 3rd attack of that kind in just a few days. The machines had already been spotted long before they got close. They were hit by impacts that started to sap the momentum of the attack. They ended up being forced to deploy the soldiers in unplanned positions while being blown up by the drones. Some men, unable to get out in time, took the brunt of the violence, groaning on the ground, hearing more of the thunder that took the lives of their comrades. Another column tried to approach during the assault. The Ukrainians were ungrateful for this visit, opening fire on more armored vehicles, which were unloading their men between the houses before being blown up. At the end of those days, Counterattacks had been liberated, taking at least half of the major advance the Russians had made in August out of their control. At the end of those days in October 2025, Counterattacks had been liberated, taking at least half of the major advance the Russians had made in August out of their control. The Russian motorcycle squads gave up on the attack obeying orders to try to hold on to that exceptional advance. The flashes, followed by the dense gray air, gave the signal for him to exist. Their corpses discouraged the Russians from continuing with so many successive attacks in the region. There were many thrown on the road, bodies that would fill the air with the horrible smell of the tragedy that is war. The soldiers themselves filmed the result of what they experienced during those attacks. None. The corpses of their brothers thrown on the ground because of the reckless decisions of their commanders. Soldat. Some of them used harsh words to criticize the commanders who dared to commit such madness with so much disregard for their soldiers. There was little lucidity, a lot of stupidity, or little value for life in sending those absurd waves of attacks to be repeatedly repelled. But as long as there is flesh and metal available, men who do not feel the fire of war in their own homes are bothered to send more material to be ground up by the nightmare machine, Ipali, that had been running for 3 years in that conflict